I'm Elliot, and welcome to Conflict Uncovered, your go-to podcast for in-depth analysis on the complex and dynamic conflicts shaping the Middle East, Israel, and the world. Join us as we delve into the latest developments, historical contexts, and the geopolitical forces at play. We bring you the insights you need to understand the issues that matter most. Stay informed, stay engaged, and uncover the truths behind the headlines. Hi, and welcome. It's November 3rd, early afternoon here in Israel. Fighting in Lebanon continues. We just had some rockets intercepted just to the east of us. Yesterday, we were actually in our shelter as rockets were intercepted over our heads. And while all of this is going on, the United States is pushing for an immediate ceasefire. Amos Hochstein, the U.S. Special Envoy to Lebanon and Israel, has been saying for the past week that a ceasefire is only hours away. For a week, it's only been hours away. And Secretary of State Blinken, just before the weekend, said that we are really on the verge of implementation of UN Security Council 1701. Now, both of these statements fall into an Einsteinian category. Einstein famously said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So let's take a look at these two issues, the hours away ceasefire that isn't, and Resolution 1701 that's about to be implemented. That was passed in 2006. So to break this down, I want to talk about three related topics. One is Lebanon, and I'm not going to go into the details of the background, maybe in a different conversation, but where it stands today under these circumstances. UNIFIL, the United Nations interim forces in Lebanon, that are supposed to be the forces that establish security along the border between Israel and Lebanon, and UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which bolstered UNIFIL to actually do that in 2006. So let's begin with Lebanon. Lebanon has a long, sad history that is beyond what I want to cover in this conversation, but there are a few things that are important for us to keep in mind. Lebanon has been treated as a kind of neutral outsider victim of all the fighting that's going on in its territory. And that's a bit of a misconception, misperception. I want to start with the simple fact that Lebanon and Israel would be at war technically if Lebanon recognized Israel's existence, which it does not. Therefore, we're not technically at war because Israel doesn't exist, but if it did exist, we would be at war with Lebanon. And therefore, all the talk, and the talk in public as opposed to the legal terms that are used, about an Israeli-Lebanese border is simply a fallacy. Israel and Lebanon do not have a border. By the way, neither do Israel and Syria. Because a border is a recognized demarcation line between two countries that is recognized by those two countries. Now, since Lebanon doesn't recognize Israel's existence, it can't have a border with Israel. What do we have? We have what's known as a UN blue line. Now, this is something unusual. I don't know if it's unique. I haven't researched it that deeply. But the UN doesn't usually mark the lines between countries. The countries do. However, when Israel withdrew from Lebanon in the year 2000, Israel requested of the UN to mark the line that would be the border if there were a country on the other side of it, meaning if Israel existed, and essentially to guarantee, and this was really the most important point, that Israel had withdrawn from all of Lebanese territory. As a result, and anybody who's been up to the so-called border knows, and have heard me say it there, if you've been with me, that the UN marking along the border is not the border. because there is none, but rather a UN demarcation line. Now, it's a long way around to saying it, but all this talk of the border simply doesn't reflect reality. Next, since Lebanon doesn't recognize Israel's existence, but at the same time sees Israel as an enemy, the Lebanese government is a negotiating partner in Israel's war with Hezbollah, because not being simply the benign, neutral, abused party in the conflict, Lebanon is an active and, in some cases, willing participant, since Hezbollah is now part of the Lebanese parliament, in the war against Israel. So that when Amos Hochstein negotiated a ceasefire with Lebanon, neglecting to tell Israel that he was doing it, he worked out the deal with Lebanon and came to Israel and said, no, we don't accept these terms. We have other terms. And Lebanon said, oh, no, we can't accept Israel's terms. That would be tantamount to surrender, and we're not going to surrender to Israel. Now, by saying that, the Lebanese government has essentially stated outright that they are a participant to the conflict. Now, Israel has been very careful in the fighting over the past year to do minimal damage to anything that is not specifically Hezbollah related. In other words, Lebanon's infrastructure has remained intact. Lebanon's army has remained, as it exists, intact, not part of the fighting of the past year, not because Lebanon is not a participant, but because Israel doesn't want to get involved directly fighting Lebanon. We've got enough on our plate fighting Hezbollah. So, first and foremost, Lebanon, not just the territory, Lebanon, the country, Lebanon, the government, are participating on the side of Hezbollah. Still, there's a UN force, the United Nations Interim Forces in Lebanon. And their job, if you were to listen to the negotiators and to the press, is to maintain peace along the non-existent Israeli-Lebanese border, along the Blue Line, by keeping all sorts of armed forces out of South Lebanon. But if we track the history of UNIFIL, we see that it's not quite that balanced and not quite that simple. UNIFIL was established in 1978 after the Israeli operation in South Lebanon against Fatah, the good old days of Fatah, that came to be known as the Litani operation. The Litani is the river that is the northern demarcation of what we call South Lebanon. And the purpose of the Litani operation was to drive Fatah terrorists north of the Litani to keep them away from Israel, the border. And I'll use the term border for lack of a better term as a generic one, because of terrorist attacks that were coming across into communities of northern Israel. And as the 1970s progressed, rockets fired from South Lebanon by Fatah into northern Israel. Note how much has changed since 1978. Not much, only the players. So the Israeli army was sent in to drive Fatah out. It succeeded because Fatah withdrew. In other words, there was no real fighting. There was a bit, but not very much. And very, very shortly, Israel had achieved its objectives of driving to the Litani and driving Fatah out. And the United Nations said, let's put a UN force in there to establish and maintain peace. And this was the United Nations Interim Forces in Lebanon. The purpose of, and the mandate of UNIFIL, as it's called, was first and foremost to assure the Israeli withdrawal from South Lebanon. In other words, the primary purpose of UNIFIL to this day is to protect South Lebanon from Israeli aggression. Think about that for a moment. The UNIFIL's purpose is to defend South Lebanon from Israel. It was then meant to keep outside forces, non-Lebanese forces, from operating violently in South Lebanon. And that, of course, included the Palestinian terrorist organizations. And here, big surprise, UNIFIL failed. So that by 1981, remember, UNIFIL was established in 1978. By 1981, rocket fire out of South Lebanon into northern Israel, particularly into the town of Kiryat Shmona, was so heavy that the town was shut down. It was partially evacuated. It was a very, very difficult summer of 1981, and it ended with a ceasefire that wasn't held. And in June 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon to drive Fatah out again, but this time not just from the south, but from the country in general, which ultimately succeeded. This was known as Operation Peace for Galilee. A bit optimistic, but nonetheless. In driving Fatah out, Israel thought that it had achieved its overall objectives, but what it achieved really was an important tactical one, but not a strategic one. Because while all of this is going on, and somewhat related, although preceding the 1982 invasion, the Iranian regime, now the Khomeiniist Islamic Republic, had begun setting up a new militia organization in Lebanon called Hezbollah. So while it wasn't a simple trade of get rid of Fatah and gain Hezbollah because the mechanisms were different, the result was that by the mid-1980s, Hezbollah was operating in Lebanon instead of Fatah. Without Fatah, Fatah was out. And the other Palestinian terrorist organizations, although they remained in many cases in the refugee camps. And, of course, beginning in the early 1980s, striking against both American and Israeli targets in Lebanon, most famously the Marine barracks in Beirut, killing 241 Marines. The U.S. Embassy was bombed by Hezbollah in Beirut twice, and Israeli military installations and positions as well. That devolved over the 1990s into an ongoing war of attrition along a belt in South Lebanon that Israel commonly referred to as the security zone, because its purpose was to keep terrorists, in this case Hezbollah, away from the Israeli border. I always called it the insecurity zone because in there it was a merry mess. And as Hezbollah gained in professionalism, training, equipment, organization, all coming from Iran, of course, it began to inflict more and more casualties and gain more and more successes against the Israeli forces in South Lebanon in the so-called security zone. This led to an Israeli withdrawal in 2000, a story in and of itself and perhaps for another conversation, but the result was the Israeli military withdrawing entirely from South Lebanon and abandoning our Christian Lebanese allies in the south, many of whom, some 7,000, fled into Israel with the withdrawal. It was all under the doctrine of then Prime Minister Ehud Barak, which was articulated in Hebrew as Anachnu kan vehem sham, we're here and they're there, meaning we're going to pull across the border and they'll be on their side, we'll be on our side, we won't bother them, and they won't bother us. Now, the only problem with that doctrine is that it missed the large print of Hezbollah's raison d'etre, which is to destroy Israel. In other words, pulling back to the border for them, Israel pulling back to the border and going over to the Israeli side and not the Lebanese side, simply meant that Hezbollah could move all the way up to the border and establish itself there. But what about UNIFIL? UNIFIL really didn't do very much because UNIFIL's mission is to prevent non-Lebanese violent organizations, armed organizations, from moving into South Lebanon. And Hezbollah is a Lebanese organization. So it really didn't fall under the category of the mandate, although everybody thought it should. That is, everybody outside of Hezbollah, the Lebanese government, and UNIFIL. The upshot of it all, of course, was the war in 2006, what we now call the Second Lebanon War. The Second Lebanon War took place in July and August of 2006, and in the month of August, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1701, which called for a ceasefire. The Israeli foreign minister at the time, Tzipi Livni, hailed this as a great accomplishment, perhaps the greatest accomplishment of the war, because it called for the removal of all armed groups from the south, primarily the Israeli army. So the Israeli army withdrew in the assumption that UNIFIL was now going to guard South Lebanon from incursions. There are only a couple of problems with that. Once again, UNIFIL's mandate, even under 1701, was to prevent foreign groups from operating in South Lebanon, and Hezbollah is a Lebanese group. But worse than that, Hezbollah is not mentioned specifically in the operative portion of 1701. It's mentioned in the preamble and the discussion of the fighting, but in the operational part, Hezbollah is not mentioned. What is mentioned is the disarming of non-military, in other words, not the part of the Lebanese military, militias, according to the Taif Agreement of 1989. Now, the Taif Agreement was a very important agreement in Lebanon. It ended that phase of a multi-phase civil war that had been going on for decades, sectarian violence that was tearing the country apart, and called for the disarming of all sectarian militias. All of them agreed. The problem with Taif is that Hezbollah was specifically excluded from the militia disarming, because Hezbollah claimed, and this was supported by the Lebanese government, that it was not a sectarian militia, but rather a resistance organization against Israel, and therefore should remain an armed group. So, UN Security Council Resolution 1701, based on Taif, actually agrees to the arming of Hezbollah and does not specifically prevent Hezbollah from moving into South Lebanon. So, the problem isn't UNIFIL, and the problem isn't Hezbollah in this case. It isn't even Lebanon. It's an American total misunderstanding, and an Israeli one to a certain extent, total misunderstanding of what the mandates, documents, and resolutions say in respect to South Lebanon and its relation to northern Israel. We would like to think that the UN would call for overall peace. It does not. And those who have been following the past few weeks, UNIFIL has refused to give up its positions as the Israeli moves in against Hezbollah. And from their perspective, they're absolutely correct. Their job is to prevent Israel from operating in South Lebanon. They're not there to stop Hezbollah. And that's okay because they haven't. The American agreement that's being cooked up calls for the Lebanese army, by the way, part of which answers to Hezbollah, to move into South Lebanon to finish the destruction of Hezbollah's terrorist infrastructure in the south and maintain peace and security, backed by UNIFIL. Israel says that's all good and well. We'll be happy to pull out. We'll be happy to let others do the job, but on one condition. And that is that we retain the right, as part of the agreement of the ceasefire, to go into South Lebanon, either air or ground, and enforce the ceasefire if, and here it's more when than if, Hezbollah begins to violate it. By the way, in 2006, it took Hezbollah exactly 24 hours to begin to violate the ceasefire agreement. Lebanon says that would be a surrender to Israel, and they absolutely refuse to accept an Israeli enforcement of a ceasefire as a condition for Israel withdrawing from Lebanon. So that's where we stand. Lebanon, an enemy of Israel. Hezbollah, part of the Lebanese parliament and a sworn enemy to destroy Israel. And the United Nations interim force with a mandate and a Security Council resolution whose purpose really is to prevent Israel from defending itself against those attacks. And they wonder why the Israeli government isn't willing to accept. So, the fighting goes on. As I said, we are on the 3rd of November, and until somebody out there realizes that Israel is not going to allow Hezbollah to go back to where it was a year plus ago, Israel will continue to have to do the job on its own, destroying the massive above and below ground infrastructure that Hezbollah has been putting in since 2006. With that, until our next conversation, be safe, stay engaged. Thank you for listening to Conflict Uncovered. As always, it's been another rough day in the Middle East. We hope you found this episode insightful and engaging. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share and recommend with your friends, and review our podcast on your favorite platform. For more in-depth analysis and exclusive content, join our community and follow us on social media. Stay tuned for our next episode as we continue to explore the critical issues shaping the Middle East and the world. Until next time, stay informed and stay safe.